Hi, everybody. I'm Tracy Swedlow, and this is the Swedlow Show. And I'm totally thrilled to welcome Paul Shatskin, who is the author of The Boy Who Invented Television, in my opinion, the definitive biography of Philo T. Farnsworth. And if you have, who is the inventor of television, of course, electronic television. And if you have talked with me any time in the past, you know that Philo is my hero. Paul, therefore, is also my hero. And I'm really excited to have him here to talk about this young farm boy whose vision gave birth to television, of course, back on September 7th, 1927 in San Francisco. So today we're going to talk about how Philo's vision still impacts our world of television, and also the fact that Paul here has launched something called the Top 100 Moments in Television on Instagram, which will lead up eventually to the 2-year anniversary. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Hi, Tracy. Good to see you again. Thanks for the nice introduction. Let me just offer a couple of one note of gratitude and another correction. So thank you for describing my book as the definitive biography of Philo T. Farnsworth, because that's how I describe it as well. So it's nice to hear those words from somebody else. And the countdown to the centennial has not yet made it to Instagram. It very well could sometime during this week. In the meantime, it is on the web at a new domain that I have obtained just for that purpose. It is 100yearstv.com. So that'll take you to the website for the countdown, and it's available on Facebook, and I'm just starting to distribute it in earnest this week.
Before I go into the interview, tell us why you are launching this every week, posting on Instagram and the web.
I think that the world should know how television arrived on the planet, that it came as a gift from a very special individual of whom we have very little knowledge. And it is fortunate, timing-wise, that we can observe the centennial of the day on which actual video arrived on the planet, which, as you say, was September 7th, 1927. We have 2 years to build awareness around the centennial of that event in 2027. And some months back, as I was talking about it with some people, I got this idea that we could put something into the firmament once a week for 100 weeks prior to the centennial. And so for the last several months, I've started developing this countdown of the top 100 milestones in the first 100 years of television. And that will launch in earnest tomorrow on Monday, October 5th, which gives me 100 weeks out from the centennial in 2027. And in the past few weeks, starting on September 7th of this year, 2025, I've put in some preliminaries that explain all the circumstances that existed prior to Farnsworth's conception and then realization in 1927.
You're also doing a podcast, correct?
That's right. I've joined the legions of people around the planet who have a podcast. And so each web post that I am doing about one of these milestones and the preliminaries that I've done so far is going into a podcast. And that podcast will be accessible from the website, which again will be 100yearstv.com.
I have to plug myself briefly because why not? But I'm doing, of course, the musical called TV the Musical. Essentially, I was inspired by your book. So there's that. My URL is tv-the-musical.com. So
right.
Stay tuned for more information about that, of course.
Did you need the hyphens? Had somebody already grabbed it without the hyphens?
I got to redo that URL. I really do.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me have to go there.
Yeah.
Okay. But first, what's the first moment you're posting 100 weeks out?
The first post in the actual countdown is dated to September 3rd, 1928. That is the day that the San Francisco Chronicle published the first actual news item about Farnsworth's work under the headline, SF Man's Invention to Revolutionize Television. And that kind of let the world know that much of the work to develop television prior to that moment had become obsolete and the clear path forward had now been paved. And that news also reached the wire services and may have reached the industrial forces on the East Coast that were trying to develop television. And that would have been the first news they got, that real television was now present in the world.
I have a great scene actually in the musical where David Sarnoff, who was the antagonist, sort of the antagonist to some extent, reads the
Sort of.
news, reads this
Yeah.
this and
Yeah.
and it sets him off, and that is the whole concept
Yeah.
behind my musical, and of course, it's the meaning behind the whole story in your book, as well as
Yeah.
well, not the entire meaning, but it's definitely an important sort of a plot point or concept.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think
so
the
yeah.
Farnsworth story is a really good, useful object lesson about how original ideas get drawn into the mainstream and the forces that oppose them and buffet them, and then maybe limit what further contribution people can make in the years after. And that's certainly true also of the Farnsworth story, but we don't need to get into that detail now. But this is the quintessential 20th century story of how technology arrives and then how it is developed and absorbed.
So, why do you think it's vital, especially now, for people working in media today and streaming and developing artificial intelligence, Gen AI content? Everybody is definitely still developing television content, no matter how it's created. Why do you think that this is important for them to understand this origin story? Why do you think it's important now?
Because we're reaching a kind of a flex point in human evolution. And I think that video is very much a part of that. And I've learned things over the past year or so, or become aware of aspects of this story that have deepened, enriched my appreciation of it. And that stems from understanding what the true theoretical origins of video in its day were. So this is where I ask people the rhetorical question: do you know what Albert Einstein won his Nobel Prize for? Now, it may not be a rhetorical question for you because we've talked about this before, but you know the answer. And it's interesting because I just had this conversation with some friends last night. And the expected answer to that nearly rhetorical question is relativity and E equals mc squared. But the truth of the story is that Farnsworth was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1921 for the first of four papers that he published in 1905. Make a note here, Farnsworth was born in 1906.
You
So
mean
the
Einstein
first,
won that? You said Farnsworth. It was Einstein who won
did
that.
I say Farnsworth? I meant Einstein won the Nobel Prize
Yes.
in
Yes.
blah, blah,
In
blah,
physics.
my mouth broke.
Yes.
Yeah,
That's
Einstein
okay.
Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1921 for the very first paper that he published in 1905, which was the quantification and articulation of the photoelectric effect. It's the paper
Yes.
where he very famously reveals that light is part particle and part wave. And that becomes one of the cornerstones of the quantum mechanics that defined science in the 20th century. Now, to turn that back to try to answer your question, why is this important to know as we enter the 21st century? It's because in his subsequent papers, Einstein went on from that cornerstone to first confirm the existence of atoms in his second paper, to reveal special relativity in the third paper, and that led to E equals mc squared. So what I am trying to convey to people is this idea that television, which we take so much for granted today, actually comes from the same well of cosmic knowledge that later gave us nuclear energy and atomic bombs. And mankind is very much at a flex point in our understanding and utilization of all those technologies. And learning more about the Farnsworth story tells us more about where that knowledge came from.
But and of course, quantum physics is as important as ever, and understanding
Yeah.
that. And I'm sure Farnsworth read all of those papers, right? It was clear, and he
Yeah.
actually had a long conversation with Einstein, I believe, later in his life. But
Yeah, that
he
came
was
much
very,
later. I should
yeah.
probably finish that discussion by adding that the reason that we have television now, or the reason we got television in 1927, was because of Philo Farnsworth's native ability to employ the photoelectric effect in its best form, starting with the concept that he got in 1921, which was essentially the embodiment of the photoelectric effect in a vacuum tube. And then it was another 6 years from when he got the idea to when he was actually able to deliver it on a workbench. And when I speak of the things that I've been learning in the last few months, I think the important note to make here is that all the attempts at television prior to Farnsworth's engagement in 1921 to 1927, when we talk about the Nipkow disc and the spinning wheels that were understood to be television until 1927,
Like John Logie
they
Baird.
did
John Logie Baird's
John Logie
mechanical.
Baird is probably the most notable. There were several others in the United States that were using the Nipkow disc, which traces its origins to a German, Paul Nipkow, in 1884. So I'm trying to draw the distinction between the electromechanical physics of the 19th century and the quantum mechanics of the 20th century, which were what were needed to realize real television. And here's where the important difference comes in. When you talk about the Nipkow discs, they shined light on a subject, the light was reflected off the subject and then scanned by the spinning disc. So those machines scanned the light. Farnsworth's contribution, and it cannot be underestimated, is that he came up with a way to scan not the light, but the electrons. So he converted the light to the electrons first and scanned that. And you don't even think of that unless you have a thorough understanding of the photoelectric effect and how it can be put to work in a vacuum tube. And Philo Farnsworth was the first to have a concept that worked and then to make it work. And then here we can invoke Roger Penrose's famous quotation that to have the right idea is one thing, but to have the right idea and make it work is everything. And while other people had had the idea of using cathode ray tubes to create a television system, Farnsworth was the first to have an idea and make it work.
Just the idea that such a young man who did that at 19, although he envisioned this at 14, right, with the drawing. But just
That's
that
right.
somebody like that in the early part of the century, when understanding the difference between a particle and a wave and understanding how to scan electrons and just management of electrons, just
Yeah.
as a 19-year-old in the early part of when that science was still new, it's mind-boggling. I don't even understand what it means to scan and light and to turn them into electrons. I
Yeah.
need to ask a physicist how one does that, which is it's
Right. Well,
mind blowing.
good luck with that, because it took the most rarefied intelligence of the 20th century to be even to explain that to the other most rarefied intelligences of the 20th century. So, but it was
Okay, so
what Farnsworth achieved in the spectrum of human understanding was a breakthrough of epic proportions in what humans can do with the fundamental forces of nature, one of which is electromagnetism.
you said it.
Yeah,
I still think that electromagnetism is going to play a huge part when we're trying to figure out quantum gravity, but we're going off topic.
yeah,
I'm
right.
always
Well, yeah,
interested
I've
in
got
physics.
my interest in Farnsworth
Yeah.
has drawn me into some of that study as well, but we don't need to go there today.
Okay. So I'm actually curious, by the way, and I want to get more into the industry today and AI and
Sure.
everything else soon. But I'm also curious, do you know who invented the screen? Did Farnsworth invent the
Well,
screen? I actually don't
the
know.
screen is like half of the equation. And the idea of using a cathode ray tube, which was actually first developed by a German named Karl Braun in 1897, the idea of using a cathode ray tube for that purpose had been around since the first decade of the 20th century. There was a Russian named Boris Rosen who actually developed some devices using the Nipkow disk as the transmitter to break the light into individual components, and using a cathode ray tube as the receiver. And in England, a man named Archibald Arthur Swinton, A. Campbell Swinton, Lord Swinton, he also proposed and published a couple of papers about using a cathode ray tube for both the transmitter and the receiver. So the idea of using cathode ray tubes had been percolating around. So it's a little more difficult to say who invented the display, the screen. But the missing piece through all of that was not the display, but the camera, the device that could create the signal that the display could then display. And that is the missing piece of the puzzle that Farnsworth added to the equation.
Okay, so also the word television has been around for a long time. People, and it was in the culture. It's kind of curious because it literally means seeing from afar. I think tele is that Greek or Latin?
Half of
And
it
then
is
vision.
Greek. I don't remember which is which, but I do know that half of it is Greek and half of it is Latin. And I remember some other historians famously saying once that this is a word that is half Greek and half Latin. No good can ever come from it. But I believe
My husband who understands Greek and ancient Greek and Latin, Richard Washburn, told me the other day that it really technically should be teletheater because theater means to watch. And but anyway, there's that.
There were lots of names for it.
Watching from afar. Technically, it would be teletheater. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, there were lots of names for it. Well, there was radioscope, telephonoscope, the electric telescope is what Nipkow called his invention. But the word television, to my understanding, was first put into use by a magazine publisher. His name was Hugo Gernsback. And he published Science and Invention and some other magazines that were probably where Farnsworth learned of the concept in the early 1920s. And just as a sidebar to that, Hugo Gernsback, the name Hugo is the name of the award that is granted each year for the best work in science fiction. And that name comes from Hugo Gernsback, who is considered one of the early deans of science fiction.
So I would say, would you agree with me that today we're living through, pure examples of television, right? Streaming, Netflix is in every country, YouTube is in every country. FaceTime, I can call my daughter on my phone. She's in England. VR, of course, seeing from a distance. So, wouldn't you say that we're kind of living through that even today without people realizing that we're still living in that century of television? I mean, people don't think about it, but we are doing it every day.
Yeah, I've made the observation on several occasions that we have reached a point now where our entire economy and culture is dominated by screens. You almost cannot do anything today without doing it on a screen. And the example that I use is you can't park your car anymore without scanning a QR code. And that
Watching
idea
the video, watching video on if you have one of those reversible video mirrors.
Yeah, right.
You park
exactly. Before you scan the QR code to pay for the parking, you back your car into a parking space using a video display. And my point is that all of the video technology that we enjoy today started in Farnsworth's brain in 1921 when he was plowing that field in Idaho, and then made it work for the first time in 1927. And that you can draw a straight line, even though the technology, particularly of the displays and of the cameras as well, has changed by orders of magnitude in the century since it was first realized. It all becomes possible that evening on September 7th, 1927.
Farnsworth didn't really have institutional backing, of course. He was bootstrapped. Yeah. I don't even know if they called it bootstrap back then. Yeah. It was a small little group in San Francisco, his lab gang. By the way, if you're in San Francisco, you can find the marker on the corner of Sansom and Green Streets. The building is still there. I was in it this summer. It was such an honor to be in that building. And I know you did a big interview also at that building recently. But what do you think that modern day technologists and entrepreneurs could learn from his story of perseverance, and because he really just believed in the possibility of television, and he got cracking on it. Well, he borrowed was it $5,000 from those two investors, right?
Right. It started in 1926 when he was working for a community chest campaign in Salt Lake City for a man from San Francisco named George Everson. Give me one second here. My Marco Rubio moment. So in 1926, Farnsworth met George Everson, who was a financier from San Francisco. They were working together on a community chest campaign in Salt Lake City. And I'll just make the story as quick as possible. George asked, he went by the name Phil by then. He dropped the O from his name. He asked Phil what his plans were for the future. Phil told him of this idea that he had. George said, well, that's a pretty crazy idea. I don't profess to fully understand it, but it sounds promising. And he had $5,000 or $6,000, which was about, I don't know, 60,000 or more in those in contemporary dollars. He said, I put that aside to take a flyer on something. So we offered him that money and brought him to the West Coast, set him up first in Los Angeles. Then George went up to San Francisco and talked with some banker friends there. And they eventually staked him to a $25,000, what we would now call angel investment, and set him up in the lab, as you say, at 202 Green Street, where the work was done between 1926 and 1927, and then further work until he moved to Philadelphia in 1931. But he was always suffering under capitalization. And his investors, they wanted to sell their enterprise out as quickly as they could to a company like RCA. But
It
I'm
was
not
during
sure
the
what
it was during the sorry to interrupt, but it was during the Depression, and all these people who had a little bit of money, they wanted to cash out, right, as quickly
yeah.
as possible. There was no sort of stability. There were no rules. Corporate espionage we can discuss later. There are no rules
Yeah.
about how things get invented. It was a wild west.
Yeah. Well, I don't know really I'll have to think about how to answer the question, what is the lesson for today? Because that's kind of fraught. But certainly the inspiration we take from Farnsworth is that he knew his own mind well enough. He understood, on some sense, the source of his own inspiration that, as he said much later in his life, he knew to be of a divine inspiration. And what he sought to do, sort of natively and instinctively, was to build the kind of enterprise that Edison had, where he had enough income capital flowing that he could follow his imagination wherever it took him. And that goal diverged from the goal of his investors, who could see, as one of them said in 1928 or so, that it would take a mountain of money as high as Telegraph Hill to bring this crude invention to the marketplace. They simply wanted to cash out as quickly as they could. Farnsworth wanted to maintain his independence because he understood the value in what he had created. What he may not have taken into account was the extent to which his predecessors, the Edisons and Bells and Morses and Marconis, the vested interest that had formed around them, that he would now find himself competing with.
I mean, I believe his goal was not only just to make money for himself and his family, and I know he wanted to have
Yeah.
enough money to keep inventing, like you were saying, but he wanted television to bring the world closer. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because the streaming world, I think, has some experiments here and there that's trying to do that, but are they really carrying out that vision, or is it really just about monetization? What's your I mean, what
Well,
would Farnsworth think today about, Netflix and YouTube and these platforms or other platforms that don't try to internationalize? That's a
Well, there
bit
are
kind of a larger
stories. There are stories about Farnsworth being frustrated or disappointed with how television was utilized in the decades of its first commercialization. His family told me stories when I first met them about the night he got up out of his chair and switched the TV off and told his kids that there was really nothing for them, nothing on it for their intellectual diet. But whatever frustration he experienced with the corporate industrial priorities that drove television into the marketplace in the 1950s and 60s, I think he came to peace with in 1969. And so I don't want to spoiler alert, but when he had always believed, he had seen far enough into the future to think that he himself would have the means to travel into space. So he was looking at all of this from a very different perspective from simply selling soap and cereal. So when he sat with his wife in the afternoon of July 20th, 1969, and they watched as a camera tube, which he learned from his sources in the industry was based very much on an advanced design of his own image dissector from the 1920s, the tube which was described to me as having everything that it needed and nothing that it didn't need, and therefore made sense to put on a spacecraft going to the moon. But when that camera was deployed and the images came up on their TV in Salt Lake City, and then Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon with his famous statement about one giant step for all mankind, Philo Farnsworth, the inventor of electronic video, turned to his wife and said, "This has made it all worthwhile." That
You
was
thought
one of the
he had
largest
worked with,
audiences. Let me just say, that was one of the largest
yeah.
audiences ever assembled at that point, something on the order of 600 million people. So I would say that that was a realization for him of what he believed to be the potential of the medium, which had to be mostly set aside in order to commercialize and monetize it.
It's actually a big moment in my musical. But
It should be. Yeah.
I was under the impression that he was working with NASA secretly. Is that not true?
I'm not aware that there was an actual working relationship at that time. Now we're talking about the period in the mid 60s when Farnsworth's own inventive efforts were turned toward the nuclear fusion he was doing, the nuclear fusion research he was doing under the umbrella of ITT, which had acquired his company in 1949. Now, the ITT Farnsworth company did do a lot of military contracts, so there may have been a direct relationship, but my understanding was that it was not a direct relationship, but that he had sources in the industry who had told him that when they came to design the tube that was going to accompany Apollo 11 to the moon, that they went back to the original image dissector design for that.
Uh, I want to go actually backwards a little bit to the relationship between Farnsworth and Sarnoff, or the idea of the creative genius or the inventor versus corporate control, because we're still seeing a lot of that today with the writers, battle against the corporate institutions and whether or not they are affected by the creation of AI. And there's just a lot of uh, incoherence in the industry as far as what's the role of the creator today, especially with, like I said, the rise of Gen AI. So uh,
Mm.
with Farnsworth's battle with Sarnoff, where the corporation was trying to seek control over his invention, do you think that sort of echoes what's still going on in the culture today, or is that completely different in your opinion?
I think I'm of two minds of it about it. I certainly think that the the story of television as it unfolds during the 1930s could have gone differently if David Sarnoff of the Radio Corporation, remember that was the Radio Corporation, RCA, if he had been of a different mind with regarding to what he considered his competition, which was General Electric and Westinghouse and AT&T. And so in that environment, he felt the imperative to own everything. And once he learned that Philo Farnsworth had actually obtained the indispensable fundamental patents to do electronic video, he made an inconsequential offer for the use of the, not for the use, but for the ownership of those patents, and refused to enter the kind of licensing agreement that Farnsworth wanted to have in order to maintain the ownership. It could have gone very differently if Sarnoff had said, all right, how can we license these patents? How can we work together? And after Sarnoff visited Farnsworth's laboratory in 1930, there's a story before that. We don't need to go into the details, but he made an offer of $100,000, which was ridiculous. It was laughable. And then after
I'm
he was,
curious to know what $100,000 would be today. I was almost going to try to look this up, but go ahead.
I think it's a million. I think we're looking at 10x. Um, so do your homework on that one. But even then, that
Okay.
was a laughable amount of money for what Farnsworth had going on his workbench. Um, and when he was refused, he went back to New York, and he had Vladimir Zworykin working for him in Camden, and they proceeded to engage patent litigation, all based around the basic idea that around which RCA was formed in the early 1920s, this edict that the Radio Corporation was formed to collect patent royalties, not to pay them. And they tried to pursue that policy through the 1930s until they lost their litigation with Farnsworth, one case after another. And finally, in 1939, RCA, which at that point had invested somewhere between 10 and 13 million 1930s dollars to develop television, mostly to get around Farnsworth's patents, when it became apparent that they could not do that, they finally settled with Farnsworth for a minimum of $1 million in patent royalties.
I just looked it up and it comes out to roughly uh, close to $2 million.
Yeah. So
So there you go.
imagine offering $2 million today for Instagram. How much did Instagram sell for when Facebook acquired it, however many years ago that was?
I remember WhatsApp sold for like 1 billion. I don't know about
Yeah.
Instagram. I
And
can't remember.
Instagram sold for $1 billion to Facebook. That's why Meta now owns Facebook.
Right.
So
Well, no, Meta owns Instagram. Meta always owned Facebook.
yeah,
But
I'm
yes,
sorry. Yeah, yeah.
it's
Yeah.
okay.
But so
Uh,
so so that was like offering to Philo Farnsworth and his enterprise in 1930. That was like offering $2 million for something that was easily worth $1 billion.
I don't think they even understood what the concept of $1 billion back then, but maybe Philo did.
Yeah, right. Right. It wasn't until the 1960s that was it Everett Dirksen who famously said, "Yeah, a billion here, a billion there. You're talking real money."
Do you know? I know we obviously know that Farnsworth didn't like some of the crap content on television,
Yeah.
but what did he think about advertising? Because, I mean, his invention always needed to be monetized. I'm sure he would have been aware of that. But if he would see advertising today, do you think he would be disgusted, or
Well,
would he realize the practicalities of this? Maybe as an
I
inventor,
don't
you
want
don't want
to.
to.
I don't want to speak for a man that I never met. I didn't meet anybody in the Farnsworth family until 4 years after he died. Ironically, it seems I did not even know of his existence until the summer of 1973, which was 2 years after he had died and gone unnoticed by the industry that benefited from his existence. I do know that he took a fairly dim view of much of what he saw. I don't know anything specifically about how he felt about advertising, but you have to go back, and this is one of the things that I'm exploring in the countdown to the centennial in 2027. I have done a couple of pieces already that talk about the advent of advertising and how that became the foundation of the broadcast industry. It could conceivably have gone differently, but I think that we're very much experiencing the long-term cultural impact of an economy that's based on advertising when it might have been based on subscriptions or some other means. And now we're seeing that the need to gather eyeballs for advertising is having a deep impact on our culture, our economy, and our politics.
If you had to choose a moment that best represents television's ability to hold up a mirror to who we are, which would it be and why?
Well, I wish you'd asked me that question so I could have thought up a good answer, because I've already used the example of the moon landing in 1969. I think that was a pivotal moment, another pivotal moment in human evolution. When we get to satellite broadcasting, one of the milestones that I'm going to cite was, I think the very first international satellite broadcast was when the Beatles played All You Need Is Love for an international satellite broadcast. Farnsworth would still been alive for that, but I don't know if he would have seen it. Um,
Give us a few highlights of some of the top 100 moments on
Well,
TV.
we're certainly going to cover moments like Elvis Presley's appearance on Ed Sullivan, as well as the Beatles. I have learned a great deal about Ed Sullivan and the contributions that he made to the racial profile of television in the 1950s. There's a great documentary about that on Netflix right now. So
I
those are the
saw
kinds
it.
of things
I
we'll
saw
cover.
it.
We'll cover the
Yeah.
tragedies like the Kennedy assassinations in the 1960s. I think one of the highlights that's worth making a note of is the first Live Aid in 1985, when a worldwide satellite broadcast was used to raise money for the benefit of the people who are trying to resolve the famine in Africa. Now, that's a moment that Farnsworth would have found as beneficial, as meaningful as the moon landing in 1969. Some others that I'm now looking at, I'm getting into the streaming era near the very end, and I think the moment when Netflix went from DVDs to streaming is an important milestone. So here's one of the most important milestones that now comes to mind. So in 1950, MIT was developing a computer. It was the first computer to which a CRT was ever added as a display. And that gave them much more real-time capabilities. So that is the beginning in 1950 of the merger of computer technology with television or video technology that we are very much experiencing today. And then that manifests further as we get into the 21st century. Facebook was the first site to have 1 billion users. That's going to be one of the milestones. And when the audience tilted from a majority broadcasting to a majority streaming, which I think was just in the last 10 years or so, that will also be one of the milestones.
How about the invention of MPEG-1 when television became digitized?
I'm going to touch on that. I'm going to go back to the 1960s when the very first digital sensor was developed at Kodak. That's going to be one of the milestones. For example, I do talk
Or
about the
HD,
advent of
of course,
huh?
HD. And HD
Yeah, I
in
mean,
general.
I'm looking at both the technology and the content that the technology enabled, because all of that evolves in parallel from 1927 through the century leading to 2027. So I'm going into both of them. And so I'm going to touch on the image orthicon tube, which turns out to have been a Farnsworth invention, which was the dominant tube that was used through the 1950s and into the early 1960s. So I'm looking at the evolution of the pickup technology, and I'm going to talk about that when I get to the section somewhere in the 1960s where the first charge coupling device was invented, I think, at Kodak, which is the beginning of digital photography and digital video, and brings us to where we are today, where everything is essentially digital. But my point through all of this is that 1927 is the flex point that made everything that came before it, apart technologically in the form of the spinning discs, made all that obsolete and made everything that we have now possible. And there's been 100 years of evolution over the course of that century.
It just seems like there's such cultural amnesia. People don't have a clue about
Yeah.
television. I've mentioned this many times to people in the industry. I've mentioned it many times to people in San Francisco, and nobody has a clue where all of this came from.
Yeah.
It's kind of like people are definitely knowledgeable. Who invented the light bulb? Who invented the telephone? I guess they don't know who invented the washing machine, but this is something you'd think they would know.
Well, that's it. That's it exactly. Our culture is built largely on innovations And the stories behind those innovations are part of the culture and are the story that we tell ourselves. And so when I first saw anything about Philo Farnsworth in the summer of 1973 in that issue of Radical Software magazine out of San Francisco, the Video City edition, it was a wonderment to me that I didn't know any of this. And something resonated with me at that time the way nothing else has. And it's been the one continuous thread through my entire adult life, for better or for worse.
The other thing that we didn't mention is that we are hoping to put together an event
Yeah.
that would be on September 7th, 2027, called the Centennial Celebration. Yes, you're excited about that?
We're in the early planning stages of it, but my hope is that we can do something in San Francisco that it somehow reverberates around the world to celebrate what happened at that location on that date, which has been a unifying factor in modern civilization.
When you revisit his story, when you think about it, do you think we're in the middle of a new technological revolution? Do you think Gen AI is on that level? I'm curious what he would have thought about interactivity. I think he thought about interactivity, if I recall. I mean, he actually thought about that and envisioned it. I know he envisioned the idea of a screen in the middle of space, like sitting, like projecting
Mhm.
somehow in the middle of space. How far did he go
I'm
with
not
his
sure what you're
imagination?
referring to there. I know that when the only time the man who invented television ever appeared on it was that I've Got a Secret episode in the summer of 1957. And he speaks during the free time after they've given him his carton of Winston's and $80 and thank you very much for inventing television. He pontificates a little bit. He's actually talking already about high definition displays. He's talking about preserving bandwidth by not transmitting over, like your background here, that doesn't need to be retransmitted each time in each frame. So there's ways to save bandwidth by just pasting that. If he uses the word paste, the backgrounds would be pasted. And then he goes into his talk about the nuclear fusion work that he was doing. So I think that with his understanding, his native understanding of the world of physics that he came into by being born as part of the generation for whom quantum mechanics and relativity were the foundation, that he had a very different understanding of the universe, and that he would probably cast all the experience and technology that we're exploring now as all part of that flex point in human evolution, which effectively started 100 years before his time. I've made this statement several times. Humans of some kind have walked the earth for hundreds of millennia, but it is only in the last 200 years that we have mastered electromagnetism and the fundamental forces of the universe. So everything that we're experiencing now and seeing now is part of a really major turning point in human evolution that separates this generation and subsequent generations from the millennia before that. Does that answer your
Well,
question?
that does answer my question. I
Yeah.
I really appreciate your taking the time to go through all of this. I actually have a quick question. What is the difference between the word television and video? Because you use video quite a lot.
Television was the terminology that was being used during the early 20th century to describe this next step in communications, starting with the telegraph, then going to radio, and then television was the term that was used to describe the next step in electric communications. But more specifically, what television did was add the visual component to the radio spectrum. And so that is what we think of as video. So video just speaks to the picture element of the whole spectrum of communications, and the terms are essentially interchangeable. So until really sometime in the 60s when I think the first portable video cameras, the Sony Portapack, became available to the general public, we really thought of the medium as television. And then once it becomes available for the general public, the word video begins to enter the vernacular. And now they're kind of interchangeable.
You know, there's a big debate on LinkedIn about whether or not YouTube is television. I think it is. I think anything on a screen, we discussed this at the beginning of the interview. I think it is. What do you think? Do you think Farnsworth would think YouTube is television video?
I've talked about my speculation about how Farnsworth would feel about YouTube on a couple of occasions, and I think that he would love YouTube because it provides the kind of forum for the educational content that he expected the television would be best at. And so you can learn anything you want now on YouTube. But whether or not YouTube is television or video is television or television is video is, can we possibly think of something more pointless to debate? Because I want to make sure I know where that debate is happening and not go there.
I think the idea is they're asking whether or not connected TV or big screen in your living room is television, premium content is television, and everything else is not. So there are two camps that separates.
Yeah.
Personally, as we discussed in the beginning, like when you're parking your car or you're looking at your watch or you're watching your video on Instagram, I personally think it's all television. I think Farnsworth envisioned the idea of communication of visual and audio on a screen, and that YouTube is television. That's my feeling.
Yep.
But okay.
Well,
so
okay. We'll stop there.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So Paul, well, that's the end of that debate for now, but thank you so much for sharing your time, your expertise, and for writing the book, The Boy Who Invented Television, because I highly recommend it. It's easy to read. It's interesting, full of detail, full of family stories. And of course, you know the Farnsworth family and interviewed Pam Farnsworth, who I also met. And I'm so proud to be your friend and your colleague on all of this. I appreciate
that, Tracy. And I'm enjoying the work that you're doing too. And I hope that yours comes to fruition as well. And I'll just close by saying I am really enjoying this journey through these first the 100 most important milestones in the first 100 years of history. And I hope people will join us because there's a lot to learn there about the evolution of the medium and the content over those 100 years. And I'm posting it all. The URL I'm using today, it could change tomorrow, but we're looking at 100yearstv.com.
And we'll put the banners in the ITVT newsletter. So thank you so much. Go to Amazon and buy his book.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Tracy Swedlow. This is the Swedlow Show on TV. Thanks so much.
Absolutely.